We just stepped on their face with a hobnail boot and broke their nose. We just crushed their face.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Glory UGA podcast, the podcast of, for, and by the most diehard George fans on planet Earth. And today, I've got another edition of our spring practice primer series for you, where I'm breaking down every single position unit on the Georgia football team ahead of spring practice, which, don't look now, does open the week of March 10th, just about 2 weeks away, which is music to my ears. I know it is to yours as well. We did quarterbacks last week, so go check that out if you've missed that. We did wide receivers about 2 weeks ago, so go check that out. But today, I'm setting my sights on the big uglies up front, the Georgia offensive line. And look, guys, I know that the offensive line for any team is probably the least sexy position to break down, but sexy topic or not, in my estimation, this could certainly be considered the single biggest question that this Georgia football team has to answer heading into the 2025 season. The way that the offensive line shakes out for Georgia, the situation on this offensive line could very well end up being the most important factor in determining how far this Georgia football team goes. Obviously, you got to have great quarterback play, and there's some questions there. There's going to be questions all over the place. More questions, I think, than we've had under a Kirby Smart Georgia team going into a season in quite some time, maybe since like 2016. Been a long, long time. But sexy or not, we've got to talk about this offensive line because it was a problem last year, guys. It was up and down, and there were a variety of issues. Injuries played a major role in the issues we had on the offensive line. No doubt about it. But injuries or not, there were issues, and the numbers spell it out for you guys. Look, I'm not one of those guys that think stats tell you everything. I think they can be instructive to a degree, depending on how you take them and the context around them. But no matter what numbers you're looking at, our offensive line performance was probably the worst we've seen in the entire Kirby Smart era. That's what the numbers would tell you. So from a number standpoint, we averaged 124 yards rushing per game, which was 15th in the SEC. I know you guys know this. There are only 16 teams in the league. So we weren't last. There's that. I guess that's the silver lining, but we were almost dead last in the league in rushing. That's just not what Kirby Smart Georgia teams do. We were 102nd nationally in rushing offense. In fact, we were 61 yards below the previous season average low for a Georgia football team in the Kirby Smart era. It was back in 2019, we averaged 185 yards rushing. If you remember, that was the James Coley year, and yeah, man, that was a disaster offensively. We all know that. That lasted 1 year, it was gone. But even that year, now we had DeAndre Swift, there's that. We still managed to rush for 185 yards a game. This year, 124. And even from an efficiency standpoint, it still wasn't good enough. A little bit better, but not much. We only averaged 4.06 yards per rush. Guys, barely 4 yards a rush. That was 11th in the SEC, 84th nationally. Not good enough. It's that simple. Not good enough. And in terms of pass protection, that's been one of the strengths of this team for years. All these guys are put in the NFL, left tackles, right tackles, guys making NFL rosters, starting in the NFL. We gave up 25 sacks last year. 25. Go back to 2023, 13. We gave up almost twice as many sacks last year as we did in 2023. Back in 2022, we only gave up 9 sacks, single-digit sacks in 2022. 2021, a little bit more, 16. But the 25 sacks that we surrendered a year ago, guys, that was the most in the Kirby Smart era, even more than 2016 when everything was a work in progress in Kirby Smart's first year. So clearly the numbers tell you it wasn't good enough. And it wasn't just the numbers, guys. The eye test told you that as well. We all sat there. We all watched it. I still can't get the Ole Miss game out of my mind. I still have nightmares about that game and just basically how we got Carson Beck killed. We got our running backs killed. It was an absolute disaster. It was a disgusting performance by the offensive line. And I think that was the low point of the season for the offensive line, but it certainly wasn't an anomaly. That's kind of what we see as what we saw as the season progressed. So this is clearly a position that we've got to find answers at. But the problem is, it's going to be almost a complete makeover. We're losing multiple starters on this offensive line. You're losing Tate Ratledge. You're losing Jared Wilson. We're losing Dylan Fairchild. you say what you want about him, but at least there's some stability, some veteran experience with a guy like Xavier Truss. So we're essentially losing 4 starters off of last year's offensive line. Now, there's a couple guys that do return that have started games for us, multiple games for us, but you could certainly look at it and say we're losing 4 starters. Now, you might argue, hey, man, you just read the numbers. They weren't good enough. So maybe it's a good thing we're losing those guys. I don't know, man. I do think we have some talented young guys that I hope are ready to step up into the mix and exert their will and find a spot in this offensive line. But when you're losing 4 guys, and a guy like Tate Ratledge, who started a long time for Georgia, played a ton of football for Georgia, and Jared Wilson, a guy who's going to be drafted, probably not in the first round, but probably a second-day draft pick, might work his way up in the second round. He's getting rave reviews, going back to the Senior Bowl, and we got the Combine this week. You're losing guys like that. Dylan Fairchild, who I think, when healthy, he was banged up most of last year, when healthy, was a really good player for us. So we got to find some answers. One way or another, we cannot have a repeat of last year. It wasn't all on the offensive line. Certainly, it's never all just one position that's the problem. But if I was ranking the issues for our run game last year, the offensive line play would certainly be at the top for me, and it wouldn't be particularly close. So let's dive into these positions. We're going to start with the center position. To me, it's pretty clear who the front runner is to start at center. I think it's got to be Drew Bobo, right? So he started the game last year. He's been around a long time, guys. And look, I know that this guy wasn't a big-time recruit. I know how most of you feel about Mike Bobo. By extension, that's probably how you feel about Drew Bobo. I get it. Wasn't a highly rated guy. You think it's nepotism. I understand that. However, if you turn on the tape and go back and watch him when he had opportunities to play last year, I don't think he was a disaster. Now, Ole Miss, he has some high-profile misses. There were some bad plays. There's just some whiffs against Ole Miss. But that was essentially the case for everyone on the offensive line. That defensive line was really, really good. Don't want to make excuses, but just an explanation for you. But if you go back and watch the rest of Drew Bobo's season, really kind of outside that Ole Miss game, and there were some decent moments in the Ole Miss game for him, I thought he played fairly well when he got opportunities out there. Now, as a starter, as a full-time starter, a guy that we're going to lean on in that role, be like one of the leaders on this offensive line, we haven't seen that yet. So there's some questions there, but I feel pretty comfortable right now to say that Drew Bobo is going to be the guy at center for us. He's a redshirt junior, been around a long time, been in the system. When he came into Georgia, he was not ready. He had to get bigger, had to get stronger, had to learn all those things. He's done that, right? And I think that he'll be a solid player for us at center. Now, I don't think he's going to be as good as Jared Wilson when Jared Wilson was healthy. Jared Wilson's a legit NFL center. Drew Bobo, probably not, if we're being honest. But in terms of a guy that's been in the system and has put a lot of reps in practice and got some game experience, and I think, again, looked pretty good in those reps, I think he'll be a solid option for us at center. Now, backing him up, I think there's some questions here. Malachi Tolliver is the guy, from my understanding, has been getting some reps at practice. He's going to be a redshirt freshman. Didn't really play at all last year. But he's a guy that I think kind of fits into that mold. He's a little bit bigger. He's actually about the size of Drew Bobo. They're both 6'5". Tolliver's 320. Bobo's a little smaller at 305. So I think he's going to get a look to be the number 2 center behind Bobo. You got a guy coming in this as a freshman, this 2025 number 2 ranked 2025 Georgia recruiting class, Cortez Smith from Parkview High School. I think he is going to have an opportunity to maybe work himself into the 2 deep there at center. And then a wild card, I don't see him playing center, but if we, look, guys, you know how many injuries that we've had on the offensive line the past couple years. It's been a freaking mash unit. It's been awful, man. So you got to have emergency options. And I think a guy like Micah Morris, who we'll get to in a minute, I think is obviously going to start for us at one of the 2 guards. I would say right guard. We'll see there. Our left guard, I'm sorry. I would say left guard. But I think that Micah Morris is a guy that could potentially, with his experience in the system, maybe do a little bit of cross-training at times to be an emergency option there at center. Because it's all about, if you have injuries, guys, what's it about? It's about getting your 5 best guys on the field. And the easiest way to do that is to cross-train some of these guys, especially guys that have been in the system for a long time and are able to maybe absorb more information than just this one position. So I think he might be an emergency option, but I don't see him as a major contender to be a starter there. I think he's more of a guard for us. So that's how I see the center position breaking down. Let's go to right guard. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So my general take on the offensive line last year in terms of like the guys that were playing for us, you got a guy like Tate Ratledge, who you know is a stud, right? That guy probably going to be a first-round draft pick, but he's going to be drafted fairly high in the NFL draft. I think he's going to be a long-time starter in the NFL. I already talked about Jared Wilson. Look, Xavier Truss is what Xavier Truss is. He's a nice utility piece, not an elite guy. Dylan Fairchild was banged up most last year. I know he played pretty much every game, but I don't know if you guys don't know this, he basically wasn't practicing during the season last year. But he was going out there during games and gutting it out. Now, there were some times where he didn't look great, but you also have to understand, he was banged up. Injuries were a major issue for us last year. But if you look at and I think the interior play was largely pretty good for us last year. Our issues were primarily the edges, more than anything. I'm not saying that we were perfect on the interior, but some of the issues we had inside on the offensive line were injury related. Tate missed multiple games. Wilson missed games. Again, Fairchild didn't miss games, but was banged up and was just gutting it out for us out there. Our issues were at tackle. And I kept saying all last year, if you're new to our podcast, what I was saying all last year was that the guys that are, I think, the best options, the most talented options at left tackle and right tackle for us were just not ready. They were young. The youngest guys that we had in our offensive line room at tackle were probably our long-term best options, like highest ceiling guys. They were just freshmen. They were young, and they just were not ready. So I think a big question becomes this year, how ready are those guys at tackle? But now with the guys on the interior also moving on, how ready are those young guys on the interior? A guy like Daniel Calhoun at right guard, who was getting some reps with the number 2 offensive line during spring practice last year, during fall camp. When I went to a practice last year during fall camp, he was getting a lot of reps with the number 2 offensive line. But you got Dylan Fairchild, you got Tate Ratledge, you got Micah Morris. You really got 3 guards there. We're rotating those 3, and Daniel Calhoun just couldn't quite do enough to earn himself a role in that guard rotation. But I do think that he's right now has to be a favorite to start at one of the guard positions for me. I think he takes over for Tate Ratledge at right guard, 6'6", 325, Walton High School, big-time recruit. Made some waves in practice again last year as a true freshman, but now with a year in the system, a year of reps under his belt, getting a little bigger, getting a little stronger, all those things, learning to play with better leverage, using your hands, all that kind of stuff, all the nuances of playing the position. I think Daniel Calhoun could be in line to not just start for us. I kind of expect that right now. It's not a done deal. I think he's a leader in the clubhouse at one of the guards, but I think he could have a pretty big year for Georgia. I think very highly of what this guy can be, hopefully as early as this year, but he's certainly going to be pushed. A guy like Jamal Merriweather, 6'7", 305, been around for a long time. Merriweather is a guy that is going into his redshirt sophomore year, so it's year 3 for Merriweather. Look, he hasn't really played any meaningful snaps for us. Like a lot of these guys that are in contention for starting spots on our offensive line this year. But I can tell you that he is a guy that I have heard consistently from people I know and trust here in Athens around the program, that it's a guy that the coaches like, and he's starting to come on. Now, will he come on enough this offseason to earn a starting role, to push a guy like Daniel Calhoun? Potentially, I don't know. Like I'm that's why I'm fascinated by this position. There's like basically every position except maybe center, I think it is pretty open here. Now, you can look at right or left guard. I think Micah Morris, he's got one of those guard spots set up, but I think the tackle positions are still very much in flux. I think right guard is still very much in flux. So there's some movement that can happen here, and there's certainly some opportunity for guys to come in and make a move for themselves and move up that depth chart. Another guy to watch out of the 2024 Georgia recruiting class is Marquise Easley, 6'5", 325. And look, I really liked what we did in the 2024 recruiting class on the offensive line. Again, I thought those guys were really talented last year. They just weren't ready. They were young. And we'll see. All those guys got opportunities. They're going to get a ton of reps during spring practice. Will a guy like Marquise Easley be able to make a move? Like last year, he was behind Daniel Calhoun, behind Jamal Merriweather. Can that change during spring practice? Absolutely it can. That's why we have these practices. That's what this is for. So you have to watch what he does. And another guy in that same class, Michael Ueni, 6'7", 325. Now the size, you could think he could certainly play tackle. I think right now we're looking at him more as a guard, but could certainly get a look at tackle as well. And then speaking of tackle, this is, let's dive into this, guys, okay? I don't want to be seen as someone who's just ripping this kid, all right? Now, I know they're you call them kids. I don't know. I'm an old man now, so I still call them kids, right? I know they're getting paid now, so people feel like there's much more open to criticism. I get that. But I'm just going to be real with you guys. I'm going to try to be as objective as possible, but also keep it as fair as possible. I don't want this to get personal. Ernest Green, to me, is not really a tackle. When I watch the guy play, I do not see a guy that has the athleticism to play tackle, the footwork to play tackle. And I was saying this not even just last year, guys. I was saying it when he was starting in 2023, okay? Now, I gave him the benefit of the doubt there because I was saying, he's coming off a back injury. He missed most of 2022, pretty much all of 2022 because he had back surgery. That's really tough to recover from. So I'm like, all right, he's going to get better. And I saw him progress some as the season went on in 2023 to the point that I was like, okay, I'm encouraged some here. I think he could logically take a nice step in 2024. Well, that definitively Did not happen. Now, he's another guy that injuries played a role in him. He's another guy that wasn't getting a lot of reps in practice, and finally we just shut him down, right? Because he just was banged up, and you could see it out there, guys. Like, he was getting heavy. He was a little bit out of shape. The feet just weren't moving. It was almost like he was stuck in concrete. Speed rushers, he had no chance. No chance. I do think that Ernest Green could help us on the offensive line. I think he can be a good offensive lineman. I just don't really think it's a tackle. I think he's a guard. I'm just going to be real with you, okay? Now, maybe I end up being wrong. I hope to God Ernest Green proves me wrong. I hope he gets himself in shape and slims up and the footwork's better, the athleticism looks better, and now hopefully he's healthy and another year removed from the back injury. I hope to God that he just proves me to be a freaking idiot. I hope that ends up being the case. But I have questions, man. I have questions about him at tackle. However, it seems like we are just dead set on playing this guy at tackle. So if I had to project who's going to open this spring and probably end this spring at right tackle, I'm going to say Ernest Green. I'm not going to say left tackle because I just don't think I don't think he's a tackle at all. I certainly do not think he's a left tackle. I don't think he's the kind of guy you want protecting your quarterback's blind side. I don't, man. I don't see that. But he's going to get some looks there, I imagine. I wish that he would get some looks inside. I think that would benefit both him and the team. I need to see that before I'm willing to believe that. But I do think there's opportunity there for somebody to push Ernest Green and potentially overtake him for that right tackle spot. Again, he might get looks at left tackle. I'm keep my fingers crossed, praying to dear Heavenly Father above that does not happen. But I think a guy like Bo Hughley, if you remember a couple years ago, guys, was a pretty big high school recruit. In fact, we had to fend off Auburn late. I mean, they were coming hard after him. We were ultimately able to keep him in the mix. And he's a guy that I think has just a ton of ability. It's just been really hard for him with the guys that we've kept returning year after year to find his way into the lineup, into the rotation. But I think this could be a year where the opportunity is there. We don't, like, you can call Ernest Green an incumbent because he did start pretty much all of 2023 and most of last year until he got banged up at the end of the year and just never really got that job back. So you can call him an incumbent starter if you want, but I think it's a very tenuous hold on that job if you want to call him an incumbent starter. So I think Bo Hughley is a guy that has the athleticism. I think he has the size. I think he has the length to be able to play right tackle. Left tackle, maybe, but I certainly think he can play right tackle at 6'7", 305, good length, good athleticism. And I know for a fact, as I'm just telling you guys, people that I know, again, and trust here in Athens, we're telling me this guy is coming on as the season progressed. Now, you never really saw it in games, but, I like to ask, who am I not seeing that we should look out for next year? And Bo Hughley is a name that kept coming up. So keep an eye on him. Jazar Jackson, who is a guy that I did a video on last summer. I'm fascinated by this guy. He's a dude that was a semi-pro basketball player playing for Overtime Elite. Hadn't played football in like 4 years. Decides he's going to go the football route. We landed him very, very late in the 2024 class, like the last edition, like right before fall camp kicked off. And I'm fascinated with this guy because, he's a freaking monster, dude. You look at this guy, and he's 6'10", 350 with crazy athleticism. Like light feet. The guy was a basketball player, right? Like, he moves very, very well. It's just that he didn't play football for like 4 years. All of a sudden, now you're coming into Georgia, and you're going to try to play in the SEC and play against the teams like Texas, the guys that they got up front, teams like Alabama, the guys that they got up front. That's a tall task. I had zero expectations for him to play any last year, obviously. Like, everyone knew that, and he didn't play last year. But he's another guy that heard some really good things about his development as the year went on. I don't know where he is right now. I don't know where he is from his developmental standpoint, but I'm telling you, from a physical tool standpoint, I don't know if there's anyone that's got the physical tools in the offensive line room that Jazar Jackson has. When a guy's like, when he's 6'10", though, what you have to ask yourself is, can you get low enough? It's the oldest cliche in football, right? Low man wins. But it's so true. It's so true. When you're 6'10", it's easier for the defensive linemen, the defensive ends, whoever's rushing the passer, to get under your pads, right? It's much easier because you have a bigger target there. So will he be able to play with low enough leverage, the kind of leverage he's going to be able to need to stave off all those elite pass rushers that he's going to have to face? But from a footwork standpoint, athleticism standpoint, length standpoint, size standpoint, he's got all the tools you want. I'm fascinated by him. I think he could at least be an option there. I like last year, I don't expect him to win a job at tackle. I think he probably is going to need another year. I think that's the most likely outcome here. But I guess there's a world where maybe he could end up being that kind of guy for us. So just a name to keep in the back of your mind because, again, physically, dude's different. All right, so let's flip over to the left side of the ball, left guard. I mentioned Micah Morris earlier. This is a guy that's going into his 5th year. He is the most experienced player on this Georgia offensive line, right? Never really been a full-time starter. Was in the rotation back in 2023. Was in the rotation last year. Started a couple games when Tate Ratledge went out. Then he went out himself. Missed a bunch of time. Came back late. Started playing a little bit more. Didn't play as much when he came back. But he is the one remaining guard we have from that 3-man rotation that we've been working with really the past 2 years. So he's going to start at one of the guards. I feel very confident saying that. I'm going to say left guard. I know that he filled in for Tate Ratledge at right guard last year, and he rotated in there some as well. But you go back to 2023, when he's rotating in, it was primarily Dylan Fairchild at left guard. So I'm going to go left guard, but it certainly could be right guard. But 6'4", 330, this is a guy, again, played a ton of football for us. Really good football player. Was kind of like a third starter at guard last year. I mean, you could have played him. You could have played Fairchild. Obviously, it was Fairchild that got the starts. But Morris is really good in his own right. So this is going to be his year. We need him and Drew Bobo to be the veteran leaders of this offensive line, really set the tone and play at a high level for us, all the unknowns around them. But the guys that he's going to be, I guess, trying to stave off and keep from taking over his job, same guys that are right guard. I think Jamal Merriweather, Marquise Easy, Michael Uini, same guys. I think they're, interchangeable. Left guard, right guard. I think it's going to be the same group of guys there. Now, left tackle, one guy we have not mentioned yet, Monroe Freeling. I know a lot of you probably still have some hard feelings. Probably still up in those feelings about the sack fumble against Notre Dame late in the first half. I mean, I know, guys. I know. But in all fairness to Monroe Freeling, he's another one of those players in the offensive line that was really banged up last year, that was not practicing much late in the season, but game days, strapping it up, going out there and putting it on the line for the G. So you got to respect that. I know it wasn't always a great look, but when the guy's playing hurt, you got to factor in that context. But I still believe in Monroe Freeling long term. I love this guy coming out of high school. I love the athleticism. I love the length. He had the frame. He had the tools that you would want a left tackle to have. The only question I had was you got a great frame. He was thin, guys. He was a little light in the britches. He had to add weight, had to add strength, and he's done that. I think he's done a really good job getting bigger, getting stronger. Another offseason will certainly continue that progress and hopefully help him out even more. But I love the athleticism. I like the arm length. It's just a matter of continuing to master that position. And I know it wasn't a great look at the end of the season. And the last image we have of him was ugly. I get that. But he also did some really good things for us at times last year. Go back and watch tape, guys. It wasn't all bad for Monroe Freeling. When he was healthy, especially early in the year, I thought he played really well against Clemson when he got opportunities in that game. So I think he is the odds-on favorite right now to be the starting left tackle. I know that last year, it was Ernest Green to open the season. I know he was the left tackle in 2023. I think Monroe, I've been saying for a year and a half that Monroe Freeling is the true left tackle on the team, especially if you're comparing him with Ernest Green. So I'm going to go ahead and pencil in Monroe Freeling at 6'7", 315 at left tackle. He's a third-year guy now. I think this is the year that we need to see Monroe Freeling take the kind of step that I think he's capable of taking. He hasn't done it consistently. He's done it in spurts, but it's time for that to become a consistent thing and for him to be the kind of player that I truly do believe that he can be. And then behind him, it's the same guys that are trying to challenge for that right tackle spot. I would say Bo Hughley, Jazar Jackson, Jamal Merriweather is an interesting guy for me. I know we talked about him a little bit earlier at guard. I think he could play tackle too. I think he's got some good length, got some good size there at 6'7", 305. So he's a name to watch there at tackle. But again, I think he's probably going to get some more looks at guard. But Monroe Freeling is the guy at left tackle. We'll see if Hughley, if Jackson, maybe Merriweather can push him. I just don't see it happening. I think the more likely outcome is if one of our two tackles does get pushed, does legitimately get challenged and potentially overtaken by one of these guys that's contending for that job, I think it's much more likely to be Ernest Green at right tackle. But there you go, guys. That is the outlook at the offensive line position, every offensive line position heading into spring practice. But we're still just getting started here, guys, with our spring practice primer episodes. We've got a ton more. We haven't even talked any defense yet. We'll get to every position on the defense. We'll talk about tight ends. We've got a ton more coming for you guys. And don't forget, check out the Glory UGA podcast. Wherever you get your podcast, this is just a small taste here on YouTube of what we have for you on the Glory UGA podcast. So check that out. Subscribe here to this channel right now. Like, comment. That's a huge help. And make sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Pod, wherever you get your podcast. We greatly appreciate you guys. Thank you for all your support. But I'm Tyler, and as always, go Dogs!
Man, is there going to be some property destroyed tonight. 26-21. Dogs on top.